in Lewin, Scriptwriting workshop. I'm going to hand over to Shuchi Katari, who's facilitating this session today. Shuchi Katari is a writer and an academic and teaches screenwriting, but fundamentally a screenwriter herself. And I'd like to say that this session is presented in association with the New Zealand Writers Guild, and take this opportunity to thank the Writers Guild for all their support over the last year in putting this event together. We've had nothing but warmth and encouragement and support from them. So thank you, Writers Guild.
I think most of you attended the session yesterday, the conversation with Ben that John Barnett facilitated. So I'm not going to give you a big introduction. I think you've heard it. What I love about Ben is that not just that he's worked across 3 continents and worked for a very long period, but he totally makes me believe that you can make any film that you absolutely put your heart and mind to it at any age. And for that I'm deeply grateful, because I love to know in my mid-40s that my best years are not behind me. The session is working back from your audience, and I'm going to try and stick to that idea as much as possible, but obviously Ben has wonderful stories and there might be some detours. And there'll be about 10 to 15 minutes at the end to do Q&A, so I'm instructed best to stick to time, so I'll try my best. First thing, Ben, welcome.
Thank you.
And given the title of the session, I was going to say that, you talked about coming across Michael O'Brien's article, something that you read, something that made you go, there's a film in here or a story in here, and then you went and thought about getting the rights, and then you met Susan, who was the real Mark O'Brien's girlfriend. And in all of this, when did the word audience come to your mind?
Probably a few seconds after I finished reading his article.
Right away, yeah?
Yeah.
And what was that thought? What was that thought about the audience?
Well, I guess I felt for a long time that choice of subject matter is probably one of the most crucial decisions you make as a writer, if not the most crucial decision. And I wonder how many absolutely wonderful films have been made about subjects that no one is interested in. I guess that also fed into my earlier belief that perhaps the most boring subject you could possibly choose is oneself. You should always look at yourself as the prospective audience in the first instance, and that writing is not necessarily a process of venting or therapy. Of course it is, and it can be the same way that painting or wall building or anything can be. But that is an occupation. And I guess when I stopped being a lawyer and became a writer, well, I was already a writer, but became a writer as a vocation. I think I was determined to try and make a living at it. Now, they sound like lofty words from someone who's spent years not making a living out of writing. But I'd say the first thing I did after I read Mark O'Brien's article was wonder whether my perception of it was skewed by my own experience, and that I failed to see the broader picture if there was one. So the very first thing I did was to call up a friend that had been at film school with me, and he now was teaching at a university in Houston, Texas, and his idea of what a good film was anything with John Wayne in it. And I knew that, so to speak, he would shoot from the hip. He wouldn't pull any punches and tell me just how broad the appeal or how narrow the appeal was. And I guess when I got his response, that he was as much bowled over by the article as I was, it reassured me that that first crucial decision, was this a subject that anyone would be interested in apart from me, that I had the confidence to say yes. I guess that's why it only took me a few seconds. It was recovering initially from the emotional impact of the article and saying, well, what am I going to do about it? That question of the audience really loomed large.
And at that time, Ben, what kind of an audience did you imagine? Because the article is very personal. Are you aware of this? We started this conversation assuming that you were there yesterday for John and Ben, so kind of assuming that a lot of you saw the film on Thursday. But the idea of the film came from an article written by the real Mark O'Brien, the poet, Berkeley-based poet, that Ben had read. And that kind of started the process of thinking about this as a film. So I'm just asking Ben very particularly that when you read the article and when the idea of the audience came to you, what kind of an audience did you imagine?
Well, initially, I think I thought of it in a very, it's amazing how quickly I was thinking of it in practical terms. I kind of saw an overall sense of the budget of the movie. And I thought, well, the audience I want is just numerically big enough to pay for what the movie would cost, which, didn't involve a huge audience. I suppose initially, there's supposedly a recent demographic which is regarded as significant, women over 50, roughly speaking. And I thought, well, even though I'm a guy and I responded emotionally, and my friend is a guy and he responded emotionally, that still didn't mean that this was a guy's movie. And you more or less assumed, with the cynicism that had built up over the years, that anything that was a relationship movie was a chick flick. So I thought, okay, if this can at least appeal to that demographic of women over 50 or adult women who no longer were led in their choices by the guy. I don't know the science well enough, but I think it's assumed that in the younger age group, 15 to 25 or thereabouts, that the guys have more to say about what film they're going to see that night. Okay. Well, anyway.
I'm glad that is not true. In the same way that your film has absolutely a great appeal for men too. So I think for those of you who saw it, I don't think you would ever put that down as a chick, what constitutes as a Hollywood chick flick.
No. Well, I remember once going back to America, and the immigration officer asked me what I did, and I said, made movies, and what was the last thing I'd done, and I said it was a movie called Paperback Romance, and he said, chick flick. So it's also a matter of public perception rather than the science of it. But look, in terms of saying, was there an audience and was it big enough? I was conscious that films about older people or more complex personal relationships did have access to a bigger market, and that there was a consciousness of this women over 50 demographic.
Right.
But having said that, I didn't think about it too much.
Yeah.
I think that probably my sense of what the audience was really became more clear when I was editing.
Yeah. Interesting. And we return to that idea that how the story kind of shapes for an audience in the edit. Coming back to this idea of a relationship, Ben, in one of your interviews, you said how finding the real surrogate, the one who actually worked with Mark O'Brien, Cheryl, and your conversations with her made you suddenly see the structure of the film. You said that it made you think that this was going to be a relationship film as against a biopic. And that's something that interested me, how an encounter with somebody crystallized for you what the shape of this film was going to be. Because if you just look at Mark's body of work, there is many ways in which you could approach a person, you know, who has written a lot through his poetry, particularly about who he was and how he felt in life, more than just the sessions. So
yes. Well, interestingly enough, there was a documentary that was made about him, which won the Oscar for Best Short Documentary in 1996, called Breathing Lessons, which certainly in America it's free on the internet, and I would certainly urge you all to check it out, Breathing Lessons. And following that success, I know that the filmmaker was courted by studios who were saying, you know, let's make a feature film out of this.
And Oliver Stone was involved or something.
Was he? Well, I mean, that sounds quite plausible, but I think that at that time they must have been talking about a kind of biopic. Right. And it never really went very far. I mean, I actually talked to Jessica Yu, who was the documentary filmmaker, and she never thought they were at all serious. Because I think there was this real aversion to something that had a bleeding heart quality to it. And although no one would come up and maybe say it in those words, you know, very interestingly, Susan Fernbach, who was the sweetest person, when I started writing it and wanted her feedback on lots of questions, she said she didn't see this film, or at that stage the script, as being consigned to Cripple Corner. And I think that because of the very particular nature of this narrative and this event, it took it out of that. Right. And the effect of meeting Cheryl was really a kind of compensation for not having Mark there as a resource.
Right. Cheryl is a character played by Helen Hunt. So Cheryl is the name of the surrogate that Mark saw.
Yes, and interestingly enough, if any of you feel you want to go to California and try the services of a sex surrogate, Cheryl is still in business.
And if you say Ben sent you,
family discount. It was, I mean, I went there really having no idea what kind of person I would meet, whether this would be a hooker in disguise or quite what. And I met a sophisticated, engaging, really out there woman who I thought was, as a character, pretty much as dynamic as Mark himself. Right. And when I saw her circumstances and the fact that, you know, behind her house was her one of her kids and her grandchildren, I thought, this is a middle-class lady. This is not, you know, a junkie supporting a habit, or it was so remote from that. It was almost like talking to one of your relatives.
Did that give you a sense of, because I think Mark in the article talks about how he, you know, that she was explaining, I'm not a prostitute, and that scene is lovely in the film when he's put the money aside in advance, and she turns around and says, I need to tell you, you know, you don't need to pay me in advance, I'm not a prostitute.
Yeah, well, I mean, I really identified with Mark in that sense, in that question was in my mind, open-minded as I was prepared to be. I still had my own prejudices, and Mark had them as well, and felt that, you know, a hooker wants the money first and then we do the business. It's I guess like, you know, I had a background in documentaries, and for me, you know, the trigger for any Cheryl, I felt I had that character, and in fact there was a time when I remember I was having an argument with a cameraman in Sydney who had this issue about what he called spinach movies, the Screen Australia shouldn't be wasting its time making spinach movies. In other words, movies that are supposedly good for you. And his advice to me was the film should be about logo. That's what people want to go and see. And I did, in fact, toy with the idea, and one version of the script began with a conference of sex surrogates, which I made up, but on the basis that I believed it could easily have been such a conference, and that it would be a way of explaining what is a sex surrogate and what was the context of it and so on. And I guess I responded to my friend's fascination with the sexier side of the subject.
Right.
But after pursuing that for a while, I thought, I don't know where I'm going with this. And I said, well, why did I choose this subject at all? And it was because I was moved by what he wrote. So I found my way back. But in the course of talking to Cheryl, I really got that immense wealth of detail that she brought to it. Questions, just those questions that you're really are a burden in a script. What do they do with their hands? What do they do with the clothing? Just how all the physical moves occur. And Cheryl was able to take me through.
And what about the emotional side? Was she open about the emotional side, or was that absolutely a big kind of leap for you?
Yes, Cheryl was one of the most open characters I've ever met. She'll tell you quite openly when she needs to go to the toilet and what for, and then come back and tell you what it was like.
No wonder for a moment you thought she'd make a better character.
And she went through the script, explaining technical things to me like, well, here you use the word vagina, you should be saying vulva, okay? And so there was the explanation. And I was a little embarrassed, this is a bit too much information. But she helped me cross that line into an area of kind of frankness and bluntness,
which was very, very important for the
which has helped the movie a lot. And in a way, there's a person who not only changed the direction of the script somewhat, but helped me with my own coyness as a person to really go headlong into the subject matter. And that's kind of like a matter of serendipity, playing that kind of thing. And above all, it as you pointed out, it swung it into a relationship movie and away from the complexity of a biopic, which I dreaded having to go
and
down
would not
that
have
road.
been half as interesting, frankly, because there is something, the fact that you have constructed a narrative around that article, which is largely about his relationship with Cheryl,
Yes.
and given it kind of dimension beyond, what those few words could give us. It seems that almost when I see that film, I feel it cannot be anything else. Like, what else do I need to know about Mark? You walk away from that film not feeling that, oh my God, there is so much about this guy that I would have known if I'd seen some other kind of movie about him. So in that way, I think it's a tribute to what you've done. What I thought about, thinking about the audience and this subject, which is difficult. The process of it is difficult, as you said, but also the subject is difficult. Somewhere you said you did not want the audience's sympathy. You did not want the audience to feel sympathy for Mark. And I thought to myself, empathy is not possible in this situation. There's a man in an iron lung who wants to have intercourse. it's not something I can just go, I can really feel that. It's really hard, but you took us there by saying, here is a person who's longing for intimacy and someone who desires to have some control over their lives. And that is something you can absolutely empathize with. So it was taking the situation of the character that was not very easy for us to go, oh yeah, I get it, but giving us something emotionally that we absolutely could relate to. So I just thought, would you want to talk about that a little?
Well, it's a complex area, understanding the difference between sympathy and empathy, and often it's a grayscale, not a line. I guess that I had my own personal issues. One of my personal issues is this is a little bit general, but it affects me as a writer. I always hated those Jerry Lewis telethons where you had Jerry's kids, because it was, in my opinion, what you might call the Tiny Tim syndrome, that all people with disabilities were like Tiny Tims. They were very cute. If you were Princess Diana, you kissed them, you held them, and so on. And the truth is that most disabled people are not cute, and they're not little children, and they're not necessarily cuddly. And beyond that, I think they're not even necessarily nice people. You wanted to...
I'm just going to interrupt so that you go there. It's what you said. You wanted to defend every disabled person's right to be an asshole.
Yes.
You told me that on the
Yes.
phone, and I loved it.
Yes.
And I loved it because to me, that had in it truth, anger, pathos, and humor, which is what I took away from your film. I felt these 4 emotions in your movie, and that sentence kind of captured that for me. So yes, carry on. Tell me what that journey was for you.
Well, I guess that some of you, as you get older, will have the awful experience of someone standing up in the bus for you and saying, "Please have my seat," before you're really ready for that experience. As a younger person, I hated it. Maybe I would have been more comfortable sitting down, but the idea that I needed that act of charity I found quite hurtful. I sometimes responded quite rudely. Now, I guess that when it boiled down to it, one of the most essential elements of the movie is the character of Mark O'Brien. And on the one hand, it's very important that, whether it's this movie or any other, that your leading character is sympathetic, that at one level you like him. But it was also very important not to pity him, or if you like, be sympathetic, or anything on that side of the line. In a way, some of my favourite characters in movies, whether I've written them or someone else has written them, has been the lovable rogue. That combination of someone who is lovable but also can be kind of evil and manipulative and selfish, and still paradoxically be lovable. And I guess this was what I was aiming at with the character of Mark, that he did fit into that mould for me of the kind of characters I could relate to or empathise with. That there was a roguishness and a manipulative quality. He does manipulate the priest, and that's one of the things I didn't want to shrink from. I think it was not a matter of people saying, "Oh, I want this guy to succeed," but just becoming engaged with his journey
thought that kind of fear of sex was something that you managed to take beyond just his disability. So that fear of sex and the fear of intimacy was something that people in the audience could relate to, or that moment when, you know, he goes, "Did you come?" And she looks at him and goes, "No." And that beautiful moment on his face. I mean, I know this is not a session where you want to be honest about your sexual experiences, but if you were to just look inside and have a little conversation with yourself, you know, there were many moments in the film where you thought this is something, you know, that rings true, that there's an honesty about that moment. And I think that, for me, that was quite powerful in the film. There's many such moments in the film, which are not about just a disabled person's experience having, learning to be intimate with somebody, but anyone having to be intimate with somebody.
I mean, it was one of the interesting discoveries that this fear of sex was something that everyone related to. That you know, doesn't matter how good looking or you know, sexually qualified you are. On those kind of those first moves, no one has the faintest idea what bit goes where. And I think the mechanical quality of their first encounters probably mirrored a lot of people's experience, you know, able-bodied or not. I know that the first time a girl consented to be kissed, I had no idea where you put your nose. It wasn't necessarily obvious to me at the beginning, but as things went on, I understood why people were relating to it, because it somehow did spark off memories of how awkward and afraid they were, you know, their first time.
And also the other thing that goes with it is a desperate need to be independent, to have control over his, you know, some part of his life, because he has such little control. And that's, again, something I think people can relate to in our own kind of varying, you know, points in our lives when we've struggled to have things, to do things the way that we wanted to do them. So I thought both those things were opening up the story to your audience in a way that a single line about, here's a film about a man in an iron lung who wants to have sex may not have done. You know, it would definitely have intrigued me.
Yes.
But that's just...
Well, interestingly enough, that idea of the craving for independence is probably the level at which it reaches very particularly to a disabled audience. I think this is one of the things that I've found since I've, you know, been reaching out to other disabled people or been responsive. I mean, I spent many, many years of my life really avoiding disabled people and in a kind of denial about who I was. But I think once I crossed that threshold and had some consciousness of how other disabled people felt, that craving for independence was completely universal, because that in a way was what was most threatened by their disability. The fact that they would have to rely on someone else to do this or this or this, and you know, I think that probably that comes first, and the desire for intimacy is next, and that probably is what, you know, is common to everyone.
But more about the script and fashion, you know, crafting the story out of a real life situation, person. Two things that I wanted you to talk about, Ben, if you could. One was, in real life, Mark O'Brien went through 6 sessions with the surrogate, and in the film you end at the 4th one. And I thought that was fantastic for many reasons, because it was quite unexpected. I don't know how you felt, but when that moment happened, when she just gets up and says, you know, and he goes, will I see you, and what do you want? And he kind of seems to have a sense how this has progressed and where it might go, and it ends. And it's just there were so many things going on dramatically because it ended where it ended. Whereas obviously in real life, you know, he did have 6 sessions. And I was wondering, at what point do you make that choice as a writer, that this is where I'm going to end this relationship?
Well, those kind of choices, for me, are not necessarily very conscious. They may be after the fact more, but essentially they're intuitive. What I look for in laying down a script initially is the tone, the level of emotion, and then later I go back and look at the structure. I mean, this may be exactly the reverse to what people are normally told.
No, structure is often a diagnostic tool anyway,
yes.
So you want to do that after you've done.
And you know, one of the to the extent that script writing is a science, which I doubt, the American approach to that science is that if you don't know what happens next, you just write the word kaboom. You have an explosion, and then the story will continue again after the explosion. And you know, brutal and crude as it sounds, there is some value to jolting the audience from time to time and doing something that is unexpected but plausible, believable, something that can happen just at the turn of the moment. And I mean, part of this was in their superb performance, and you know, that scene, not quite knowing where it's going to go. You know, what should we do next time? And all of a sudden, there's no next time. Has that effect of jolting the audience and ramping up the emotion. And one of the most interesting problems which had to be resolved in the script and in the editing was once you have ramped up the emotion to a certain level, and I think in this case it reaches its height when you have the moment between the 2 women in the car park who sort of have that moment which is entirely in the looks. And I thought, well, the problem now is not to let that emotion dissipate and go down before you reach the end of the film. So it's a double-edged sword. One is, you know, one side is you do want to ramp emotion up. You do want to give the audience a jolt. But if you do that at a crucial point in the story, in other words, towards the end of the story, you can't let them down again. That's the beginning of the catharsis, if you like. And you have to, you know, play it out according to the rule you've set up for yourself. So I felt this was a great benefit to the, you know, emotional rhythm of the script. All of a sudden, you were as the audience saying, no, I want to come back again. But you accepted the reality that in a moment these 2 people realised they had crossed a dangerous line, and that it was going to be better for both of them to stop there. I felt that gave me the ending for the movie, but also dictated some pretty tough parameters for what I could do after that.
And this then leads to that moment when he's on his own in the apartment and it's night, and that's the night where the electricity fails.
Yes.
And he can't get in touch.
Actually happen.
Which is incredible. The other thing was, in the original work, if you read the article, it ends on a very despondent note. He wrote the article and at the end said, what good came of it? You know, why did I? Well, sure, you know, I experienced this, but it's still not got me love, it's not got me closer to women. So it's what we would call a downer, you know, the end of the piece. And then his life carried on, and then there was a documentary made about him, and which at the screening of that documentary, Mark met Susan, the woman who was his lover, partner, collaborator till he died. So obviously, as someone who's adapting life, you bring that closer. You know, you had a film to do in 90 minutes, and you were not going to have him be despondent, and then have a documentary made about him, and then find love. You brought that closer. But what I did wonder is when you read that article, because it was such an important, you know, that's what got me going. Did you know, when the article ended, did you know that you were going to give him some hope and love when you did the film? Or this was what happened, this is reality, you know?
Well, I have a very interesting method of denial, or selective deafness, if you like. And when I read the article, it was as if, yeah, what a downer of an ending, and then I pretended that I hadn't actually read it. I mean, I showed it to my wife straight after that, and she said, "My God, this has got such an awful ending. How can you deal with that?" And don't worry, trust me. And somehow I had made an assumption. This wasn't necessarily the ending. Just because he wrote it at the time, okay, he felt that way at the time, but I felt that I had understood him a bit, that he was a man with probably very intense mood swings. That one day he would see life as, something awful that had been inflicted on him, and another day he would be craving to suck up as much of it as he could. I detected this in his writing, in his poetry, and I thought, okay, he just had a bad hair day when he wrote the end of the article. That was my feeling about it. And even if I had not discovered the real fairy tale ending, I think that I would have taken as my cue the high point of the relationship, which is a moment, I don't know how many of you managed to see the movie, but in the last, their last session together, she kisses his chest, and he regards himself as too ugly and unkissable for anyone to do that. And it was an unsolicited act on her part, and represented the blending of emotional and physical, which really was what he was after. He wasn't just after having, to lose his virginity and be able to say, "I'm a made man." That was the discovery that the physical and emotional could be one event, and that was the keynote of it for me, that he made that discovery. And okay, when my first girlfriend broke up with me, I felt pretty shitty about it as well. But you get over it, and that's how I interpreted his ending, that he felt the usual blues that you have when your relationship comes to an end, but you live on. Oddly enough, that didn't deter me.
Yeah. But that's interesting that you put yourself in that kind of slightly optimistic place even before you met Susan.
Yes.
There are two scenes that Ben's going to talk about a bit more at length, so we see them. And one is, I think I'll let you introduce them, but because I'm such a nerd and I love words on a page, I asked him to print out that scene from his screenplay, because there's something that just becomes more real when you see that this is what he wrote, as against what the... Yes,
Oh, no, actually, I can't do that because I'm like, they're connected. Can we?
I can tell you what it's about.
Why don't you start telling them what it's about?
Okay. One of the issues for beginning the story for me was, how do I get him to that place where he makes the decision that he wants to see a sex surrogate? And I kind of took this from life. He would periodically fall in love with his carers. And there was one relationship in particular, or almost relationship, that really broke his heart. He wrote poems about this young woman endlessly. And I thought that I would want to depict this relationship in order to create, a plausible background for him to go to that next step. I just didn't want it to come out of the ether. I wanted it to come out of that experience of falling in love with a person, craving, and finding himself being equally driven by lust as by love. The problem was I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time playing out this relationship. I mean, the relationship with Cheryl, with the sex surrogate, is kind of played out in real time, right. In a sense. And this is not. This relationship is played out in shorthand. And I am trying to manipulate the audience's emotions by using kind of shorthand methods to create that moment where he spills his guts and the disappointment that follows and the pathos of the aftermath. But I didn't want to overdo it. So it was a matter of creating a fairly complex relationship in a very compact form.
And it also then put us in a particular headspace to validate his request to the priest.
Yes.
Because we very quickly saw him go through this heartbreak.
And do you want to in fact play the clip which relates to this page?
Yes, I think you should.
And anyway, you'll see what I mean, and it's number 2, I think, or number 1. No, it's number 1.
My penis speaks to me, Father.
No, sorry. Anyway, there's a lot. It's just one line right at the end of the scene which says something to the effect of they. Is it at the top of the page?
Yeah.
Is it 11?
That's I see. Yeah.
We sense from the looks. Is that the one?
Yes.
Yeah.
This is the end of a beautiful friendship.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty heavy thing to lay on a couple of actors. You're going to play the end of your relationship without any dialogue at all. And in a way, that's what I'm talking about when I mean shorthand. Of course, it is to some extent manipulative, because I'm using those very intense kind of close-ups, music, a kind of rhythm of editing, which is telling you hopefully a lot in a very short space of time. My only problem with this, and I hope it doesn't read as a problem, both in the script and in the movie, it plays in a different rhythm, different pace than the rest of the movie. When the Cheryl character comes into the film, there's a palpable feeling of walking into a different experience with a different kind of reality, and the writing also changes in that there are no kind of apart from where it ends, there are no kind of quick solutions to the emotional ride. It is the whole story
in kind of almost real time.
In almost real time, which is, I mean, in retrospect, I didn't think so at the time, but in retrospect, I think that was a gutsy thing to do, because mostly you don't write in real time, unless you're doing a boring French movie about two people in a room. Most other things that I've written have not been written with that sense of real time. So that's just an example of how I wanted to establish a level of feeling in him, a kind of motivation that would make sense of what happened next.
The other clip that Ben's chosen, it's interesting, you know, for those of you who attended yesterday's session, the film was made for $1.3 million. This film that has kind of got everyone's heart and a standing ovation at Sundance and the audience prize and blah, 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 was a small budget film. And Ben was telling me that...
It was less.
It was even less, not less.
But I didn't say this.
But what he said was that he on this budget he shot a scene that he didn't use, and I thought, oh, that must be interesting. And he said he would like to bring that scene to talk about the one that didn't make the cut.
Yeah, there were. This was the most expensive scene that we shot. It was the longest day, and I never, in my wildest imagination, thought that I would drop it from the film, because the one thing that I really worried about was maintaining a level of optimism through the film, which was really also inherent in the humour that was an integral part of it, and I felt faithful to Mark O'Brien's own view of life, in that he did have this absurdist view of life, which you can think of as a shield or a weapon or just part of his personality. And when we were shooting these scenes, Susan Fernbach was visiting, and my wife said to her, "Look, I'm really afraid this is Ben Lewin going off on his crazy tangents." And she said, no, this is exactly the way Mark would have thought. And I, in fact, drew this, the idea from this scene out of his article. And in his article, he after seeing the sex therapist, not the sex surrogate, but the therapist who referred him, he went home and thought or dreamt, wouldn't it be great if we had sex surrogates at the nursing home where he was, where he had to stay for some time? And I thought, what a great idea! So I concocted this, this sort of version of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I think this scene in the script is after he's seen the therapist and then discussed it with his priest, and then he goes home and just thinks about it. And this is a very rough cut. I mean, if we put it in the film, it would have been a bit more elegant.
Is that understood? From now on, each of you will be assigned a sexual surrogate. And we expect you to work with this sexual surrogate at least once a day. Nice special results. Is that
Yes, Miss Ratchet. Sorry about that.
Anyway, we moved versions of that scene around to this place, to that place, all over the film. And I felt particularly bad about it because the lady who plays Nurse Ratchet is a well-known Australian actress and a good friend of ours. And I thought, well, God, she's going to be so pissed off that she did this for no reason at all. But, you know, eventually the editor kind of looked me in the eye and said, you know, if you can move it, you can lose it. And it clearly belonged in another movie, which is yet to be made. But I thought, there were other similar fantasy sequences when you know his first successful act of penetration and orgasm were, as originally written, accompanied by visions of Clint Eastwood saying, "Make my day," and his therapist becoming Madame Lash and whipping him. He also had moments where he imagined the same therapist as a hooker and himself as a pimp with diamond earrings and so on and so forth. And again, on the page, that all looked as if it helped with the levity of the film and put it onto a level that people would enjoy. And then, you know, finally, when you compared it with the reality of the relationship, which is not always possible to anticipate when you're writing it. You can write the hell out of a relationship, but really if you have the two or one of the two wrong actors, it's not going to play that way. And in the result, the relationship played at a level of reality which was beyond my expectations. And so all that fantasy stuff really just was, it was the wrong note. It was out of keeping with the tone of the film.
Can I ask a question?
And
about
I was
that?
just about to say, perfect moment to open it out, so let's do
thank
questions.
you.
Yeah.
Because you spoke at the beginning when you set out, you spoke about finding that tone when you started writing and the emotion. And so it sounds like you had an intention, but there were, a life took over, a new life took over, because I didn't get to see the film. I was working. I'm so looking forward to seeing it. But the clips I've seen I found to be funny, but I found to be very moving, and I've wanted to cry a number of times, particularly in yesterday's clips. And so I'm a little confused actually as to what I'm going to now. And I was just wanting to ask you, well, I think it's wonderful because it's both. It seems to be a drama and a comedy. But did you set out, if you had these fantasy sequences, to be writing a comedy with a heart, and then have the actors taken it to a new place, or what's happened?
Well, I didn't. My intentions weren't as clear as you might think. It really is process of just the way I see things, and my feeling that Mark O'Brien was similar enough. I mean, I felt that I could only find out so much about how Mark O'Brien talked and thought, and the rest was going to be me. And I felt that that was probably a good match. There's probably a lot in common in the way we thought. And the very first words that you hear him say, I mean, apart from his poetry, which introduces the film, but the very first words which are part of the narrative are, okay, focus, scratch with your mind, because the cat has just brushed its tail across his nose and woken him and given him terrible itches. And so they're his first words, scratch with your mind. And that is supposed to be a very immediate key to who he is. That sense of the absurd, that you can even scratch with your mind. And the next thing we hear him say as part of the narrative is, when his minder, who doesn't like the first one, says, wants a favour, she wants to pay in advance. So he doesn't know what that is. He says, what, you want help moving furniture? And it's supposed to confuse. It's supposed to say, well, here we're looking at this image of a really desperately disabled guy, but he's talking as if he's a stand-up or lie-down comedian. I guess in laying down a tone, finding his personal language was the crucial part of that. And he always, he did have in his own writing and in films that are, bits of film that have been done about him, some fabulous one-liners. I either used some of them or was inspired by a lot of them. And I think one of the memorable lines in the movie is, my penis speaks to me, Father Brady. That's what I think I mean by establishing a tone, which is inherent in the way your main character talks. The Cheryl character doesn't talk that way. She has her own sense of humour, but she isn't a quipster, and he certainly was.
Thank you. With regards, one question. With regards to the piece of script we saw, I noticed in the final cut you had the voiceover. Was the voiceover in the script from the beginning?
No, that's a very interesting observation, and my one regret about the profession of screenwriting is that screenwriters don't get to do the editing, because quite honestly, the editing process is a process of rewriting the script, in a very literal way. And when we had reached a point where, it pretty much locked down the picture cut, I knew what followed what, I still felt that there was a level of emotion missing. And I went back to the documentary, Breathing Lessons, and listened to the way his poetry had been used. And I went back and reread all his poetry and decided to integrate it into the film. If anything, I didn't really technically try to do it that way, but if people were to say it has the kind of overall rhythm of a poem, I would regard that as a compliment.
And I think it also works because from the voiceover we go back into the confession. So there is this idea that you can have a sound loop over another image where you're back, so you do this kind of spatial jump, in both place and time. So the voiceover doesn't stick out as like something you did at the very end. There is a, there's a way.
I just noticed.
Absolutely, no, you're right. It's not on in the script. Nick.
I thought while it's here. Ben, it sounds like you never let the truth get in the way of the story, did you? There was truth to the story that you had to stay true to, but you were very flexible with it, weren't you?
You have to talk a bit louder.
I said, I won't use the microphone, I said you were very flexible with the truth in this story. You never let it get in the way of telling the story, which is a really important part of screenwriting. I'd like to hear a little bit about that.
Well, one of my first big experiences as a screenwriter was doing a 4-hour miniseries, which was an historical miniseries, and I was bogged down in the truth for years, and only was found the movie by using that saying, don't let the truth get in the way. But I think that I felt, number one, I wanted to use the fact that this was a true story and that there were living characters as an asset. I wanted, was aware, I think at the time I was writing that this could be a useful marketing tool, and that it was silly to throw it away. Oddly enough, I think I've stuck more to the truth in this particular film than in any other. Even down to details like the cat. I mean, typically you would think the cat, which bookends the movie, is a bit of filmmaker shtick. However, he did have a friend that was an alley cat that did come and visit and did exactly what this cat did, gave him terrible itches. So I did rearrange the chronology of things quite a bit. I mean, one of the most oddball episodes in the film is where Cheryl converts to Judaism and has a ritual bath in the Orthodox style. And I had the courage to put that in and integrate it into the story because it did actually happen. If it didn't actually happen, I don't think I would have done it. But it works, even though you think, where the hell are we? What's going on? So I'm sorry to contradict you, but in a way, I felt I owed something to the people who were still, who were part of Mark's life.
Yes. Okay, just without the mic then.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm a lecturer, I tend to project. My question's in two parts. When you're working with actors of this caliber, do they tend to shape the script as well, given that they're the ones that are delivering the lines? And if they do have changes or suggestions, how do you judge who gets the final say about the script?
I get the final say. However, it's an interesting question in this case. I mean, Helen Hunt is particularly vocal about her opinions. Some people might have a discussion, she might have a tirade. But she's really smart and can occasionally come up with very useful things. Now, sorry, I didn't mean this. There was a whole strand in the script which was to do with her and her prepubescent son, and that in the course of the story she comes out to her son about what she does for a living. And it's a very dramatic scene, mostly in one scene. I thought that it was really important in kind of giving depth to her character and trying to explain the paradox of what she did. However, Helen's attitude to it was that this was not a film about her character. This was a film about the guy in which she was a character and that to go off into the story of her and her prepubescent son was really a diversion. Now, as I was auditioning kids for this role and hearing the kids play this scene, I began to understand what she was talking about. And I thought, this is absolutely right. This could really, kill a moment. Number one, I found it very hard to find an actor that was good enough to not have to lower the bar. And ultimately, I eliminated that whole strand from the script, which was, really initiated by her, telling me her opinions about it. And I think she was right. In other instances, she was totally wrong. She did approach things with a kind of a standard of political correctness, which is very Californian, and felt that, in their first meeting, she compliments him on his shirt. Now, she felt that this was patronising and condescending, and I didn't feel it was at all. And particularly his shirts and his fetish for shirts was part of his personality. It was one of the few ways he expressed the way he looked. And it took quite some, talking around the point before she finally, okay, I'll do it. Now, in their first scene together, when she's struggling to take off his clothes, and she says for a second time, nice shirt, and he said, you already said that. That's her first moment of vulnerability, and it's a very important moment. And if she as a character had thrown that away, it would have much diminished her character. Equally with the very first lines that she had, which was telling her son not to call her by her first name on the phone. She says, I'm not your girlfriend, you can, call me Mom. And she said there was something distasteful about girlfriend. And so I struggled to find other expressions. School friend, pal, blah, 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 blah. And in the end I thought, well, the very reason the line works is because it does have a little edge. It's not a perfectly correct thing to say. And again, mercifully, I won that argument. But actors do get this preoccupation with words here and there, and the whole thing explodes out in all proportion sometimes. Fortunately, all our discussions were civilised, so it never got unpleasant. And as I say, I did find that in particular details, I would listen and we would argue, and then I would come back to where I had started, except in that case where she persuaded me, and I think quite correctly, that the subplot about coming out of her son could be damaging to the overall story. John also made, added lines here and there and so on. And if it was a line which came at the end of the scene, I wouldn't argue, okay, I know what I'd do with the cutting room anyway. So in order to be polite, I would often concede, say, okay, we can add this and so on. But by and large, we stuck to the script. I don't know if any film that I've ever done where the leading actors don't suggest new dialogue or altering dialogue. And I think it's sometimes just insecurity. And I'm personally pretty open to suggestion, but not if I think they're wrong.
Okay, one more question.
I
Yes,
just like to comment on that. I'm all right, because I am a writer, but I'm also done quite a lot of acting work. At the end of the day, as the actor, you've got to make sense of the character's beginning, middle and end. And we do get anal about the odd little word because it's got to kind of synchronize in that kind of emotional world. And sometimes it can be insecurity, but sometimes, as you say, sometimes it works, sometimes it makes it better. Sometimes it may just be an actor who wants that little bit more of attention. Because which ultimately leads to what I really wanted to say is I loved your film. I absolutely loved it. I've never laughed and cried so much in the course of 90 minutes. And your two leads, I pretty much would put money on the fact that they'll both get Oscar nominations. On the subject of Helen, I wanted to specifically ask, because she specifically, as a mature woman, spends most of the film nude. And it's not just shoulders, it's her ass, it's her tits, over and over again. You know, there's not a lot of actresses who could bring such humanity to a character in the nude so much, and I'm like, how on earth did you guys handle that aspect of shooting this film that is so revealing on more levels than just a physical layer? Because that's a bravo actress who can do that.
I think you should tell them about the DOP, the story.
Yeah, I think that because I had the DOP that I had, Jeffrey Simpson, and Julian has worked with Jeffrey, I was really ahead of the game. And Helen was, naturally very anxious about all that, and wanted to have it spelled out. How are you going to shoot the sex scenes? I said, we're going to do them exactly the same as all the other scenes in the movie. There's going to be no special techniques, no special lighting. It's just going to be like another story element. No, we need to know exactly what happens here and there and everywhere. So the cameraman and I went to her place. She told him to lie down on the bed. She straddled him this way. She straddled him that way. I mean, they were real Kodak moments. I wish we'd made a little, bit for the EPK. And that somehow seemed to help get it off her chest. Together with the fact that she realised she would have to trust the cameraman. And
you're up vulgar at one point. You know, it's really, it's. I don't know what.
Yeah, I think she wanted to do it myself. I mean, I think that underlying the whole thing was, I have a great body for a woman my age.
She does.
I'll show it all to you if you make me look beautiful. I mean, that was never spelled out, but I think that was the underlying message, that ultimately she was proud of her body, and that it wasn't as much of an ordeal. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't the one naked, but I know that, for instance, on the first day that she had to do a nude scene, it was the bathhouse scene, it was the mikveh, and the bathhouse attendant was Rhea Perlman. If you remember.
She's great.
And when you do nude scenes, there's this kind of ominous silence that falls on the crew. Everyone is solemn and respectful. It's awful. And so when she dropped her robe, all the guys on the crew gasped inwardly, silently. But Rhea Perlman just came out and called out, "Wow, what a body!" and that really did loosen things up. It was the perfect remark from the right person at the right moment. And I think that what you're seeing on the screen is the result of a very special relationship between the leading lady and the cameraman. I mean, she trusted me because I'd written the script, and and she embraced the script and knew that you couldn't be coy. This wasn't a story where coyness was, would help. But I have to say that there was a very special trust between her and Jeffrey Simpson.
So great. I like to think that apart from us mature women, one of your biggest audiences is going to be adolescent teenage boys who suffer from premature ejaculation. I think they will love this movie. Teenage boys.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for